Hello and welcome. His name is behind some of the most successful bands in the world, and his style remained remarkably pioneering through the digital era, keeping him on the A-list of the music industry. This week on One, meet the renowned and amazingly creative music producer, Brian Eno.
It has a unique feel, which he describes as painting with sound. Brian Eno's early music career was marked by a flamboyant style, which put him at odds with Brian Ferry, the lead singer of Roxy Music, the 70s glam rock band they had formed together. Going solo a couple of years later allowed Eno to fully explore his own interests and to create new and cutting-edge genres such as ambient and generative music, which made him one of the industry's top producers of popular music, working with top artists. But Eno still pursues his passion for creating something different, such as putting music to words by poet Rick Holland in their 2011 collaborative album, Drums Between the Bells.
Brian, I'm glad to have some time with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're considered one of the most influential people in the popular music industry, and I wonder, when you look at this, these 4 decades or so that you've really been involved, how has it changed? What are the good and bad things about what's happened to the music industry recently?
Well, I suppose one thing that's happened is that in the past people used to tour in order to sell records. So your touring was something you lost money on in order to introduce your records to the public. But now it seems to me it's exactly the opposite, which has had some good effects. So what people do now is they produce records or recorded music in order that people turn up at their concerts. And people, I think, make most of their living from live playing, most of them anyway. But the good effect of that is that there's suddenly an upsurge in really interesting live music. It was pretty dead about 25 years ago.
I was interested to read, though, that you sort of essentially had made this remarkable career without sort of formally becoming a musician, so to speak. You didn't go down that traditional path. You were sort of wielding a synthesizer and tape recorder.
That's how I started out, yes. In fact, I always assumed I was going to be a painter. I studied painting at art school, and it was during the time I was at art school that I discovered tape recorders and started playing around with them, and I realized that you could do things with sound that were quite analogous to what a painter would do with color. So I started to form this idea of being a sound painter of some kind, and synthesizers, of course, played right into that, and especially synthesizers were instruments that really had no history, so it was perfect for somebody who couldn't play anything. It was an instrument that nobody else could play either.
It's interesting you paint with sounds, but I was also interested to read that your friends describe you as having social claustrophobia, and the one sound you don't like is people sitting around yakking so much.
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't say I'm that antisocial. What I don't like is a lot of people yakking. I find it very infuriating when there are 2 interesting conversations going on at once. If you have a dinner party and there are more than 5 people, you will always get 2 conversations, and I always want to be in the other one.
I want to take you back. Life began for you in post-World War II Suffolk in England, and I wonder how strong those early memories were for you.
Well, it was an interesting place to grow up, because Suffolk had a lot of American air bases. Big American air bases. In fact, I grew up in a little town of 4,000 people, but within a 5-mile radius there were 17,000 American soldiers, or airmen. And because there were so many of them, and because we were the only little local town, we had loads of coffee bars with jukeboxes with all American music on them. So I had a musical experience there that must have been quite unique in England. I was listening to stuff that nobody was hearing on British radio.
You called it Martian music.
Yeah, well, I didn't have any idea where it came from. For instance, I had a big record collection from this selection of stuff I was listening to, which my sister got for me on the base, the PX store. And it wasn't until I was about 14 or 15, many years after I'd started assembling this collection, that I realized that nearly everything I had was by black people. I'd never seen photographs of any of these people. I had no idea what they looked like or where they came from. And I suddenly realized that almost my whole record collection was black music. And this was a real revelation to me. I had no mental picture of who was doing the singing.
It was interesting also because your father was a postman. I think your mother was Belgian-born originally.
Yes.
And I know you described them as largely leaving you to your own devices, not having that much interest in what you did. So in what way did they influence you?
My father was very musical in the sense of he was always whistling and singing. And his father was a semi-professional musician. He played lots and lots of instruments. And both of my uncles, his two brothers, were musical as well. One was a clarinet teacher, and the other had been the big bass drum player in the local brass band. So there was a lot of music around in the family. And I think what was important about that is that I never felt at all embarrassed about singing or trying to do something musically. Just never occurred to me that it was something you would be embarrassed about. And it was only later that I realized most people were somewhat inhibited about bursting into song whenever they felt like it. And I wasn't. I never was. And I think that came from that background. So I think if you grow up in a family like that, you have an early musical confidence, which may be, as it was in my case, completely unwarranted. But nonetheless, I had it. And then my mother, she also would wander around singing the whole time. It was just something she did. She was a Belgian peasant lady, basically. She grew up in the deep countryside of Belgium. During the war, she was in a German labor camp. She was building Heinkel planes, actually. It was a labor. She wasn't Jewish, so it wasn't a concentration camp, and it wasn't as awful an experience as many people had. But nonetheless, she came to England after the war with no English at all. So my first language was actually Flemish, because that was the language she spoke to me as a kid. And I don't speak Flemish now. But she was relatively exotic in the little town and she was exotic partly because most people couldn't understand what she was saying. She had a very peculiar accent. If you can imagine the combination of rural Belgium coupled with English learnt in deep Suffolk. It was a very peculiar way of talking, and a lot of people couldn't get what she was saying.
You used to love going off into the forests and looking for fossils and actually visiting an eccentric grandfather who had like a weird collection of stuffed animals' heads and, you know, strange artifacts in his...
Yes. It was only a few years ago that I realized what a big impression my grandfather must have made on me. His hobby, apart from playing all these musical instruments, was repairing mechanical musical instruments. So he had an old church, actually. He lived in a converted church, and it was full of old hurdy-gurdies and those machines that play these great big brass plates, player pianos. And I realized, of course, it took me years to realize this, of course, these were the synthesizers of 1910, 1920, you know. It was a room full of synthesizers. It never occurred to me until recently that I grew up with the earliest synthesizers.
You studied art and conceptual painting and sound sculpture. You were in Ipswich and then in Winchester. What sort of track, sort of career track, did you think of what you wanted to do?
It's funny, you know, I didn't have any idea at all. One of the funny things about the 60s is that I don't think anybody ever thought, what am I going to do after this? What's the next step? People never thought about careers. For instance, we never had career advisors. We never had anybody come to the college and say, so what are you planning to do? And this is probably how you should do it. Never occurred to anybody that there was going to be a future. And I suppose I sort of assumed I would become an art teacher, because that was what you did if you didn't make it as an artist.
Can you remember the first recording on which you were featured?
Yes, I can. The very first one was a piece of very avant-garde experimental music by Cornelius Cardew, and it was called Paragraph 7, and a piece of music that I've written about quite a lot. I think it's a very important piece.
And it was a scratch orchestra.
Yeah, it was with the Scratch Orchestra. Yeah, the Scratch Orchestra was a group that Cardew had put together. There were about, I guess, 80 or 100 people in it, and they were nearly all art students. Very few of them were actually musicians. And it was really it was a very 60s idea in some senses, but I think very valuable in the sense it was about trying to explore the idea of creative behavior from every direction you could think of. And some of those directions were extremely strange, very strange indeed.
Now, your musical career as such, as people know, your professional musical career began in 1971 with Roxy Music. And I know you like to shoot journalists who talk about Roxy Music, but I'm going to dwell on the fact that you almost didn't get into Roxy Music if you hadn't met on the subway with Andy McKay, the saxophonist.
That's right. Well, I had, during my time at art school, I'd been travelling around other art schools with my tape recorders doing performances of this kind of electronic music I was doing. And one of the places was Reading University, where Andy was studying. Anyway, I left college and one day got onto a tube train in Maida Vale, and there was Andy, and we recognised each other. And he said, "Oh, I've just joined this little band, and you don't have any tape recorders, do you still?" And I said, "Yes, I have." He said, "Well, we want to make a demo tape. Could you give us a hand?" So I went initially to record them. There were only 3 of them in the band then. I went to just make a tape for them, but they had a synthesizer sitting there. I think Andy had borrowed it from the music department at Reading University, but nobody knew what to do with it. This was in the days when synthesizers didn't have keyboards, for example. You didn't just kind of hit a key and get a noise. You had to plug things in and sort of construct the instrument, essentially. So I sort of knew how to do that because I had been playing with electronics a bit. So I made some noise and they said, "Oh, why don't you come back next week?" And that's how I joined the band.
Because initially, yeah, you were basically at the mixing desk and adding bits and pieces back in vocals. You weren't actually on stage with the band.
Initially, yes, that's right. So I used to be at the back of the hall with the synthesizer, mixing, doing things to the instruments, and I had a mic as well, which was very disconcerting for members of the audience who would suddenly wheel around when they heard this guy behind them singing.
You did, though, when you did get on stage, you had some of the most flamboyant costumes, which is kind of an interesting thing. You know, you'd go from being like this quiet guy on the mixing desk, or at least occasionally quiet guy, but to wearing these really loud costumes.
Well, actually, I wore pretty loud costumes behind the mixing desk as well. I wore loud costumes anyway. I had been for several years before I had any involvement with Roxy. I used to have some original ideas about dress, which crossed all known gender boundaries.
It was visual art, I guess, for you then.
Yeah.
But presumably, because I know you sort of described it as having a sort of certain part in the band. It was your way to kind of amplify that part.
That's right. Well, what I was doing was using instruments that needed quite fine controls, in that they were rotary controls and you had to turn them quite carefully. So it wasn't like the guitarist can go like this and the drummer can do that and the singer can do this. I was standing there going like that. It was a very unfamiliar role for people at the time, I think, because you're now more used to seeing people do that because they play on laptops. But so I thought what stage clothes should be about is amplifying the little things I was doing, making more of them. So this is when I had this idea of wearing this quite famous now costume with feathers on it, because the feathers would tremble, you know.
It was interesting that once you left Roxy Music, it didn't take you long, just a couple of months to get your own single out, Baby's on Fire. But it wasn't long after that. You ended up with a collapsed lung. You were in a pretty bad state.
Yep. Yes, that was a difficult time. But it was sort of interesting in a way, because that marked the end of a certain approach to music, and I was happy to have a way of finishing that, because I didn't really want to have that kind of career, actually, of the touring musician in a rock band. I was happiest anyway in studios. That's where I liked being, working with that instrument that I by now had started to understand quite well. And most of the things that I was inclined to do musically weren't very suited to live performance. Again, they were too much of that, you know. It's not the kind of thing I'd go out and watch someone doing.
Well, life seems to have a way of giving you reality checks, because having had that incident with your lung collapsing, it was not that much later you actually had a fatal accident on the road when you slipped on some wet road and a car hit you. But I gather that time in hospital reflecting gave you a better insight into how your mind worked.
Yes, that was another very important full stop for me, actually. In fact, that was the most valuable one, because a particular incident happened while I was convalescing. That's when I got this scar, actually, from that accident. A friend of mine came over to see me, and I was confined to bed. I couldn't move. But as she left, she said, "Shall I put a record on?" And I said, "Please." And she put a record on and then left. The record was much too quiet, but I couldn't reach to turn it up. And it was raining outside, so it was a record of 18th century harp music, I remember. And so I lay there at first kind of frustrated by this situation, but then I started listening to the rain and listening to these odd notes of the harp that were just loud enough to be heard above the rain. And this was a great musical experience for me, and I suddenly thought of this idea of making music that didn't impose itself on your space in the same way, but created a sort of landscape that you could belong to, you could be part of. And this, I called this, I pompously gave it a new name, which I called ambient music, and it became something I no longer recognize.
Well, yeah, of course it's going to get hijacked eventually, I guess, but who do you consider to be your mentors?
Well, I would certainly say Steve Reich is one of them. But the list is so curious, actually. If I think of the things that I've listened to that have really changed my direction, Phil Spector, I'd have to say him, because certainly he was the person who started making me think about music as a product of recording rather than a product of performance. So he was very important. The Velvet Underground were very important to me as well, because that was the first band of quite incompetent players who were making great music. When I say incompetent, I don't mean that to be rude to them, but I was very aware that they came from a position that was closer to mine than to most musicians. They sort of came out of an arty background and decided to try to use instruments. You know, the drummer famously would play one drum at a time. But then there was a lot of music from other parts of the world. For instance, one of the things that really, really changed my life was a piece called Habina by Farid El-Atrash, which I heard once late one night on shortwave radio when I was on an island in the Mediterranean. I picked it up, and my radio had a tape recorder, so I could record. I was so excited about this piece, and I learnt it and know it by heart now. But I never knew what it was. And I would go into Arabic record shops and sing this song to them and say, "Have you got this record?" Which must have been an amusing sight, because I didn't know what the words were at all. And finally, one day in Cairo, I found it. I sang it to someone, and he said, "Yeah, it's Farid El-Atrash." And he gave me the cassette, it was then. But that really was a new idea in music to me, that idea of, which you find in a lot of Arabic music, that instead of harmony being the way you create color changes, you do it with different mixes of instruments. So you'd have a phrase, which is then picked up by a whole orchestra, and then it's just one clarinet will play it, and then an oud will play it, you know. So this idea of creating color by just changing the ingredients, not by changing the notes, but changing the mix, as it were, that was a very important idea. Then another one I have to mention, also from another part of the world, is Fela Kuti. In in the early 70s, I started listening to Afrobeat, and I thought, bloody hell, why are we even bothering? They're so far ahead in terms of the incredible interest and intrigue of the rhythmic structure of what was going on there. So, sorry, I could answer this question for days, I realise.
One thing that's very interesting about you is how active you are in being informed on world events, and you've been quite active and vocal on issues such as the Israeli-Palestinian situation. In fact, you and I first spoke on news and current affairs more than anything else. And I wonder, do you ever, as you get more and more, involved with that, or at least seeing these things that do bother you, do you ever fear there might be some kind of backlash on your music because of your political activism?
Well, I haven't ever been worried by it, and it's partly because I suppose it wouldn't really make much difference to my life if for example, Israel decided to boycott my record sales. I don't think I sell many records there anyway. So I don't think it would be... It's not something I imagine to be a problem for me. In fact, I would take it as rather a compliment, possibly.
You did. I want to ask you about one project you did, which is fascinating. It was in 2006. You had the project 77 Million Paintings that was specifically for the PC, which is quite unique in its own way, because you're using a medium that most people wouldn't have thought of for that kind of combination. What was the logic behind that?
Well, I had been... So the other thread of my life is that I've been a visual artist for a long time as well, for actually as long as I've been a musician, really. In fact, it predates my musical work. And particularly I was working with light from the age of about 17 onwards. And mostly the work I was doing was in galleries, big spaces, and expensive to put on. It involved lots of technology and not the kind of thing you'd take home. And I suddenly thought, wouldn't it be nice if you could take it home? And one evening I was walking home from my studio, and I looked through a window in a posh house in Notting Hill, and there was a dinner party going on, a dozen people round a table. And on the wall was a huge black plasma screen. Black. There's nothing showing, and I thought, that's crazy. That's where you would have had a painting in the past. But now you have a plasma screen because you want to have a TV in the house, but there's nothing you're going to show during a dinner party, is there? So I thought, that's the place where this work could exist. So I then started to think of developing it with the idea that it would be a domestic version of my gallery shows. So that now exists, and now we do gallery shows with the domestic version in multiple forms.
Being such an innovator, is it as much a source of frustration as it is of satisfaction and fulfillment, because you're always searching for something new? And I wonder what's out there left that you haven't had a chance to really tackle yet, that's on your radar.
Gosh, there's so many new things. It's embarrassing how little of them I know. Every week I hear 2 or 3 things and I think, wow, that's a good idea. That's really interesting, And I think one of the reasons for that is because it's actually much easier to make music now than it ever has been before. And it's much easier to actually put it out. You don't have the old bottleneck that you used to have of the record company with this, this very narrow funnel of what gets through the A&R department and the few radio channels. Now you have infinite radio space, basically, called the internet, and you can sell it as well if you're lucky. So I think there's a lot going on, and a lot that wouldn't have got through in the past.
How would you like to be remembered, Brian? What would you like your legacy to be?
I'd like them to say what a handsome and intelligent man he was, and what a shame he's gone.
But his music and his art remain.
His music lives on. No, I'd actually rather live on than the music. I'd be happy to swap the music.
Well, I wish you a long life, Brian. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.